entitled Memorial Stones. I am telling the story of our church and our fellowship, where we came from, and we're learning lessons about why we do what we do, the way that we do things. And this is called Memorial Stones. The title is based on this verse we're going to read, Joshua 4:4-7.
Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, one man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever."
Okay, so we are looking today, I want to begin and start looking at developing leaders. My father, Wayman Mitchell, saw that it was not healthy for everything in a group of churches to be centralized. One of the common themes I keep hitting is the difference between a denomination and a fellowship. A denomination is a group of churches, you have common beliefs, but they are held together primarily with central control. In many different ways, Bible school, church planting, missions, everything was centralized. So in some ways, our fellowship came out of Dad looking at what did not work well, what bothered him when he first became a pastor. So examining biblically. So one of the things is that he deliberately, from early days, began to decentralize. We talked about how he split off conferences, started conferences initially in Flagstaff and Tucson, with the deliberate aim of making sure that people didn't view everything in the world has to be okayed from Prescott. He saw God's plan in discipleship, raising up workers for ministry, but he understood that discipleship is not just developing men to preach, but ultimately what you want is you want to develop leaders, men who could assume roles of leadership. And so in the late 70s, Dad started gathering some men in some meetings. These are men that he saw in them leadership potential. Started meeting with them once a year, would meet in Phoenix before the Winter Bible Conference in January. And we call these, we do this to this day, these are called leadership meetings. And primarily, he obviously chose them, but they were primarily church planters, partly because someone who's planting churches has the vision. You can't be selfish and be a church planter. You're wanting to send and give out. But also, it is church planting that causes men to grow, because it will force you to lay hold of God in many, many different ways. So he had leadership meetings. The purpose of the leadership meetings, there were several purposes. Number one, Dad wanted to impart leadership principles into these men. So part of it was Dad would always teach, my father would teach, and he was basically showing these men how he thinks. That is a very important part of leadership and pastoring, is how the man, not only he speaks, but how does he think? How does he look at life? And he was trying to put that into men. But the second major part of leadership was that he wanted these men to wrestle with issues that were causing trouble in the fellowship, whether they were current issues or whether they were things that he could see down the road. That's a part of leadership. You not looking just at today, you're looking ahead. Here's a Bible principle. Revival brings life, and life brings problems. Okay, let's think about Acts chapter 15. The book of Acts is a pattern of revival, the move of God. What started happening is God is pouring out His Spirit. People are getting saved. This is the era of the Holy Spirit. Gentiles started getting saved. Churches started growing in different places. This is a wonderful part of the life of God. But as a part of that life, now you have Jews and Gentiles that are forced together in the church, which is God's plan. But what happened, Acts 15, you started having Jews who said, wait a minute, these people are eating ham sandwiches. They like bacon. They must be from hell. Now, actually, they were talking about circumcision and some other Jewish law principles. So they started saying to these on fire Gentile, non-Jew converts, you can't really be saved unless you're circumcised and you follow Jewish food patterns. So this created a crisis. This is tension between, if you're a Gentile, you get saved, and you're a man, you're not very excited about the idea of getting circumcised as a mark of salvation. And so this is a conflict. So what happened in Acts 15, they had the Jerusalem Council. We are not congregational. Okay, you understand the different types of church governments. How are churches structured? You have eldership, you have board-led, you have congregational, which is everybody voting. How do you think the church should be run? I got an idea. In that form, you get a strong personality, and he drives even if he's not wise. We are a pastor-led church, but we are also led in a larger sense now in our grouping of churches by leaders. Acts 15, the answer for the apostles was, we need to have some leaders meet together. Let's hash this out. Let's wrestle this idea through. Do Gentiles have to follow Jewish law in order to be saved? And they said it's leaders that have to do that. Acts 15, verse 6.
Now the apostles and elders came together to consider this matter.
Okay, we're going to settle it for all of the churches, but who is going to decide? It needs to be leaders. We're not going to vote. We're not congregational. We're led by men of God, but these men met together to discuss it, and then they came to a decision. No, you do not have to follow the Jewish law in order to be saved. So this is what leadership began. We had life. The churches are growing rapidly. I don't remember what number we were up to last time we met. I told you I'm giving you the numbers as we go along. We're rapidly growing, and so we discovered, just like the book of Acts, life brings trouble. Life brings conflicts. Some of these would be simple, such as we started planting in big cities multiple churches in the same city. That's great. There's millions of people. Plant more than one church. So, but here was a common problem that started arising. You have an existing church. A brother comes and wants to put a church, and he puts a church 2 blocks from the existing church. So now this causes a fight. Now they're fighting for the same buildings. They're outreach in the exact same areas. So now you got guys, they're mad at each other. They're coming to conference, and they want to fist fight. We got some pretty rough dudes saved. So this is a conflict. So this is very simple. We had a leadership meeting. What do we do about that? We discussed the issues, and we came to common. The Bible doesn't say thou shalt be 2 miles from your brother. But leaders met, and they said, it doesn't make sense. If you're going to plant a church in an area where there are existing churches, your church needs to be at least 2 miles away. That's wisdom. That's common sense. Marriage. This is a very simple one in early days. Is now we had multiple churches. So conference. Remember, we have church Bible conference and dating service. There are people, that's how they view conferences. They come together to get a wife, to get a husband. So we started having ladies from one church, men from another church, they get married. And so this was a simple problem, is you'd have a great disciple. He is on the path to preaching, but he met a girl from another church, and that pastor was saying, yeah, come, this great disciple, you need to move here. If you want to marry this girl, move to my church. And so in some cases that would disrupt the program. So again, this is a conflict that's not going to work. So leadership, what do we do about this? We came to conclusions. Very simple. The Bible doesn't say this, thou shalt, but this is common sense. In our fellowship, you marry from different churches. Where is the wedding held? In the girls' church. Where do you live after the wedding? The guys' church. That was common sense. And once we established that, then that did. We met about pastoral moral violations. What happens when a pastor sins? What do you do with him? Do we be like the Catholic Church and move them on to another parish? And we said no, and initially there was not clarity on that. We met and said no. Pastors, if pastors sin, they're involved in a moral violation, we remove them from ministry for a minimum period of 2 years, a harsher standard than anybody else. So these are things that we began to leadership. So what would happen in leadership is we often, seeing a potential existing or a future conflict, a leader is given a task. Here's the problem. You study it biblically, bring a lesson or a sermon before all of the men, and then we will discuss it. We will hash that out. And so now it would be discussed by leaders who had a larger understanding. They were church planters. And then we would reach a consensus. This is what we're going to do. And so in doing this, I want you to understand, my father was showing trust in men. Okay, he was deliberately widening the decision-making base. My father did not want to be the Pope. Okay, he did not want everything to be Prescott and you had to consult him. So he deliberately involved other men, making them wrestle, getting their wisdom. And so one of the things that happened, leadership expanded the ability to deal with problems. Because now you had leaders in areas, in different parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, wherever we were planting churches. Now we tend to, if there is a conflict in the church, we follow lines of authority. In other words, you don't go to the top, you talk to that pastor's pastor. But then we also, if you had multiple churches in an area, you have an area leader. He can meet with people. He can meet with brothers. He can sort that out. So now that means you are expanding, and that was, I don't know if you understand how much that is to my father's credit. He deliberately did not want to make everything focused on him. And so this was an early lesson. It had to do with developing leaders. We do this to this day. We meet every January just before the Winter Bible Conference. Now, of course, it's expanded. We probably have 60 leaders or so, men that meet from, 20 different nations. We gather together. Same thing, imparting leadership, wrestling with issues, dealing with things in areas, and we expand the leadership base. As a church becomes a conference center, they become a leader, and they become part of that decision-making process. Let's look, secondly, this is now a major part of our history, is the call to Australia. We planted the first church in 1978 in Perth, West Australia. I just alluded last lesson. 1979, a change had to be made. We had to send in a new worker, and he took the church in Perth. In November of 1980, my father went to Perth, West Australia to preach a revival and help the church. It was growing. God was doing good things. He went to check up on things, but to be a blessing. While in a hotel, one night in a hotel, God spoke to my father and told him, I want you to go to Perth. Because at this time, God reminded my father he had received various words and prophecies in the past about his ministry. I have a picture. Remember, I'm showing you photos of my dad's Bible. This is one. And you see here a word that he had been given in 1978 Depart, I will send you to the Gentiles. God spoke that to him back then. He didn't know what that would be, but this was something he had also received from other people. My father had a relationship with God. God was preparing him. You are supposed to go. Australia had incredible potential. Of course, it still does, but my father looking at Australia, Australia is a melting pot. It is unbelievable. People from other nations. When I last pastored in Australia, I left in 1997, the city of Melbourne, the area of Footscray. At that time, I counted, we had 35 different nationalities. And I'm not talking about I have 1/16 Cherokee blood. I am talking about people direct from other nations, an incredible melting pot of people, of course, who now have access to their home nation. Australia, secondly, had a strong economy, very, very strong economy, and this meant that there would be money to plant churches and there would be money for world evangelism eventually. The man who was pastoring at that time in Perth, my father saw real potential in him. He hadn't, as far as I know, he had planted a total of one church at that time. That was in Australia. But nonetheless, he was a good preacher, so Dad saw potential in him. And after God spoke to him on that trip, he talked to this man and they arranged to swap churches. That man would take the church in Prescott. Dad would go and take the church in Perth. And so a number of other words, these are from my father's Bible. The abundance of the sea shall be converted unto thee. The forces of the Gentiles shall come to you. And you'll see here he wrote Australian Thrust. God spoke that November of 1980. It was when God told him to go. He began to speak to him about what God was going to do in Australia. Next text from the Bible, you see here verse 5, the sons of the alien be your plowmen and your vine dressers. And the note that he wrote under there, the Potter's House, Asian Ministry, November of 1980. The meaning of that is Australia's on the doorstep of Asia. And my father felt that the Australian churches could make major impact in Asia. They could reach Asia from there. And so in January of 1981, by this time now we're planting churches, we're planting international churches, but on a Friday night he had the Foursquare supervisor, John Holland, came and announced that going into Perth, West Australia was Wayman and Nelda Mitchell. And you have to understand how this rocked people, rocked their world. We have the newspaper. This is the Prescott Courier. And here Foursquare minister moves. And that article tells about that my parents were moving to Australia. This was very powerful. It rocked people in different ways, but one of the ways it rocked people was he wasn't just talking about world evangelism. He wasn't just saying, you need to go. He was doing it. My father believed in it. And Dad, from the earliest days of salvation, he loved missions. He loved world evangelism. They had missionaries that would come and speak in his home church in Phoenix, Arizona. He would talk to them. There was something in his heart that he loved that. He was stirred by T.L. Osborne, Miracle Crusade footage from overseas. My father wanted to be a part of that. Of course, through discipleship, he started doing that by sending, but now, here, January of 1981, he announced he was going to be going. They weren't going to leave for 5 months. They had to get their visas, and then I had to finish school for the year. But from the time that he announced that, God kept giving him words. People would give him words, or God would speak to my father in his daily Bible reading. We have some of these here. Here's Acts 2:8. Ask of me, and I'll give you the heathen for an inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. And the note that he writes under that is Australia. God spoke that in March 20, 1981. They announced in January he's not going to leave till June, but God is speaking to him of what he was going to do in Australia. Next picture from his Bible, and this is in the far right. To the isles afar off that have not heard my fame or seen my glory, you shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. And he very much felt that this was speaking about Australia, numbers of islands that Australia would make impact from there. And then one more from his Bible. The next one here, I'm the Lord that teaches you to prophet, that leads you by the way that you should go. This was spoken again, Perth, November of 1980. That was back when God originally told him to go. And the note there, you probably can't read his writing. It says, because I have obeyed God in Australian thrust, fruitfulness of ministry shall be. And he was given this word when he went to a conference in Madrid, Spain, September of 1981. So this was very crucial. Everything changed in my parents' life and ministry. I now have to tell you the personal dimension, of course, because in later times I am a part of the history. So I got to tell you how this played out in my life. My parents actually originally, before it was announced in conference, they told me one afternoon that they were moving to Perth. And they gave me a choice whether you don't have to come. Do you want to come? You can. You don't have to come. Partly my parents knew this. I was saved. I had left my sin. I still had rebellion in there. And so my father was wise. He knew that if he forced me to come, I was a minor. I was 16 years old at that time. I probably would have resented it. And originally my instinct was no way. I only had 4 months of high school left. I had taken extra classes. I had no interest in moving to a new nation, trying to fit in a new culture and finish high school. So I said, I do not want to go. And so my father made a plan, made it possible for me to be able to stay. At that time, as I have mentioned in sermons, from the time I was a little kid, I was 5 years old when we came to Prescott. People started getting saved and they started asking me, are you going to be a preacher like your daddy? And the answer was absolutely not. I did not want to. When I got saved, I really did leave sin, but my plans in life did not involve preaching the gospel. My plans were very self-focused. I loved cars. That's what I loved. That was my future, what I saw for and I blame Jerry Solberg for this, by the way. When I got saved, I had a foolish friend named Jerry Solberg who taught me to drive in a Corvette. So that shows you how foolish he was. But nonetheless, my future was going to be cars. I intended on working on cars and selling cars. And basically, that's all I saw was going to be cars. And that was going to be my life. Now, here's a lesson I want to give you. It has to do with God's involvement in our lives to bring about His will. I've talked about my father, things that happened to my parents to bring them into God's will. I was resistant to the idea of preaching the gospel. As I said, I love cars. I have a picture. My first car was a 1969 Pontiac GTO. This is not the exact model. This is slightly different, but that was my car. It was a 400 small block Hurst 4-speed, hydraulic headlights. That was my idol, and I loved and worshiped that daily. My parents, why do you have to wash it every day? Because I was worshiping, that's why. So that was my car. I love fast cars. I'm going to work on cars. I went to Phoenix. Louis Polino and I went to Phoenix. We were coming back, and I decided to see how fast would my car go. The speedometer went up to 100. I went past 100, past the brake light. I was around to 0 again when the engine blew up. And so I blew it up. At that time, I didn't have a job, so I had no money to fix this. So at that time, my parents said, we're going to move. I said, no way. But because I had no money to fix the car, I was kind of stuck. He said, why don't you come for a holiday? Why don't you come for a vacation, just have a look at Australia? If I still had that car in working order, I probably would not have gone. That car probably would have been the tipping point of saying, nope, I'm not leaving Baal there. I'm not leaving my idol here. So I wonder in the wisdom of God, you know, it was my youth and stupidity. I wonder if an angel said, go faster. To help me, because I am telling you, the fact that I blew that car up changed my life. Absolutely changed my life. So in June of 1981, finished school in May, in June of 1981, we moved to Perth, West Australia. I have some pictures of us in Australia here. Next photo, here we are in Australia. I used to have hair. I want you to know that. And I know you're jealous of my legs. Lisa married me for my legs and my money. But this is us in Perth, West Australia. My parents took over the pastorate of the church, which was located in Mount Lawley, West Australia. Next photo. Here is my parents in. This was an old, I can't remember if it was Presbyterian building or Methodist that had gone defunct. And so here we met in this beautiful old church building. Next picture, Mount Lawley. There's young people and life. That was the building on the inside. And God was doing wonderful things. Got another picture here. Later times, we started a band. I'm skipping eras, but still while we're in that building, we formed a band called 180. And there's Paul Graham on the right, Steve Count on the left, me on the drums, Lisa singing. And that was in that building. In Australia at that time, Dad often said it was like the Jesus movement that we were birthed in 1970. It was like the Jesus movement delayed slightly 8 years or so, 10 years. The response to evangelism, concert ministry was just like the very early days of Prescott. Got some photos here, various. Here is a concert. We're doing it outside this summertime. We had no air conditioning in that building, probably while we were doing it outside. Next photo, here's the concert inside. It was young people. This is in the fellowship hall. That's where we had our concert ministry. It was all young people. Primarily, the church is packed. It would be like hippies. These were surfers and hippies and different people, but it was absolutely alive. Next photo, here's a street outreach. In Australia, when they say mall, a mall in English nations doesn't mean a shopping center. A mall is a brick-paved street, and because it's a street, they can't keep you off it. It's a public place. Hay Street Mall in downtown Perth, we started having outreaches. Next photo. Here's Terry Slate, still in the church to this day. Terry Slate, street preaching in the Hay Street Mall. Next photo. Here I am, street preaching in the Hay Street Mall. That would obviously be a little bit later on, but I'm just showing you some of these street outreaches. Next photo. Here is Russell Plummer. Russell Plummer was one of the first converts when Ron and Susie went there. He was there from 1978, still in church to this day. Great blessing. There he is. That is either the Hay Street Mall or they built another one parallel to that called Forest Chase. So people are getting saved by the droves and radically converted. Perth is a beach city. We started doing beach baptisms. Here, this is, if you look at the Jesus Revolution, this was kind of our version of people going out to get baptized in the ocean. And we would do this primarily at a place called Scarborough Beach. Eventually, we moved the church there. Next photo, beach baptism. Here they are. This is Australia. There it is, bikinis and Speedos. That's what you do at the beach for a baptism. That's how we did it. We would do a combination. We would baptize and preach at the same time. Next photo, here's Larry Reed in early days preaching there at the beach at a baptism. And that's what we do. Next photo, here is us there. There's a young Steve Zapata. And there we are at a baptism. So God was doing something absolutely incredible. My reference points, when I first came here in 2004 and someone said, oh, the concert was good. And I said, why? The night before we hadn't had any visitors. I said, based on what? Hot licks on the guitar? In my reference points from Perth, people would get saved and they would get powerfully saved. It was not uncommon by the next Saturday at the concert, they would be giving their testimony. It just was a radical move of God. But the greatest thing that happened, people getting saved, was already happening before Dad got there. But what Dad did is he accelerated discipleship. And this was the previous guy was a good preacher. As I say, I only know of him ever planting one church. That was in Perth, and that was not his convert. But Dad, from the time he got there, would meet with men at breakfast, something we still do to this day. And that would be a time that men could ask questions. I have a picture. This is in later years. Some of these are pastors now, but that is what my father did from day one. When he was there, he was meeting with men to answer questions and to impart discipleship in there. Dad came and he preached again and again on destiny. He would talk about God has a plan for your life. God could use you, and would stir. And many of these were surfers that didn't work jobs. They were on the dole. They were on welfare. But he began to challenge them, get jobs. Let God use your life. And this was profound. He started doing discipleship classes regularly. Next photo. This is the building in Mount Lawley. It's a suburb of Perth. That place is holy to me. Now remember, I am going to Australia just for a look because my car is blown up. That's why I'm there. I'm going back to America and getting on with my life of cars. In that building, just weeks after we arrived, my dad did a men's discipleship class on how to study and how to put together sermons. That has nothing to do with me because it's not cars. It has nothing to do with me. I'm never going to do that. So I'm there. It's great. I'm, with the guys. But while that place is holy. Every time I go back to Perth, I go back to that building and I worship. And I thank God because at the back of the building, while he was talking about putting together sermons and preaching, God spoke to me. I'm 16 years old, and God said, that's what I want you to do. And the moment God said that, I said yes. Immediately, everything changed. From that moment, I left. I have never gone back to cars again. I had no interest in it. I began to order my life. For that, we got into the car. I shocked my father. I put my hand on his, and I said, Dad, I want to be just like you. And he knew what a change that was. Everything, I began to study. I began to absolutely aim my life toward the call of God. That meant I had to go back and get a visa, finish up high school, and go back. Dad arranged, as I said, the moment he arrives, he is talking vision, vision, vision. He is now telling these Aussies, why are we here? And he began telling them, he arranged to have what he called a vision luncheon. Fed everybody chicken. We met at the Maylands tennis club. They had a hall you could rent. And Dad started, first of all, just explaining the vision, kind of what I'm telling you. He began to tell the story and began to say, I am here to raise up Australians to reach Australia, and from Australia we will reach the world. This was incredibly moving. He put up a map of Australia. We actually have a photo here. This is very grainy because it's not a photograph. I actually pulled this from a video. I don't have access to the photo. That map, after explaining, here's the map of Australia, and he said, now vision, the people have to buy in. So he said to the people, these are now Aussies, where do you want to see churches planted in Australia? Now you have to imagine from me, I've been there only weeks. I've only been to one airport on the way to Perth, and I've been in Perth. I don't know any of these places, and many of the Aussie names are strange anyway, and to American ears, but they began to talk about these cities. Something started to happen to me as they're talking about cities that I have no idea where they are. God began to do something in me. Could it be that one of the cities on that map of Australia God would have for me? Maybe God would want me to go there. And that is exactly what eventually happened. Lisa and I went to a place called Launceston in the island of Tasmania. Kind of a humorous note, you know, in cultures, you always have between cultures, there are words that are bad in one place, they're not bad in another place. Kind of humorous. We've only been there a few weeks. Where would you like to see a church? One of those words that's not bad to Aussies is the word hell. And so where do you want to see? A lady lifted her hand. She said, we need to plant a church in Kalgoorlie because there's a hell of a lot of miners there. Hell of a lot of sinners there are in Kalgoorlie. And Dad was like, okay, all right. And he dutifully made a mark on the map of Kalgoorlie. And sure enough, we did send a church there ultimately to Kalgoorlie. The moment Dad came, 81, he had the first conference in February of 82. He is there to plant churches. He didn't waste time. He had only been there from June to February, 8 months. And we had the very first conference in February of 1982. We've got a picture. Here is the stage. It was so packed, people had to sit. That's back the old choir in the Presbyterian church. This is jam-packed. Harold Warner came. He was one of the speakers in the first conference that we did. That's me leaning over, talking during church in the back row, like you're not supposed to do, but I was doing that. But this is here. Next photo is, here is Dad. There's the people behind Dad worshiping, and that is in the first conference. Next photo. Here is a picture of the crowd. Now God is saving people. The church is growing rapidly. He invited numbers of the other Foursquare pastors because we were a part of Foursquare there, and they came. So here's the crowd that is there, and you see Dad there on the front row in his safari suit. That was very Australian at the time. Then the next photo is on the Friday night. This is, I'm pulling this one old issue of the Trumpet. Is now, Daddy's been there 8 months and he planted 2 churches. Is the Carvels and the Trotts. The Trotts went to Port Hedland, if I remember right. The Carvels went to either Adelaide or Collie, I don't remember, but one of the two. And so now the die was set. People began to see. Remember, they had never seen a conference. The first church that was planted, they didn't have a conference. They just announced it one service. So now they're seeing the pattern of what you see. 5 days, 5 nights, 4 morning seminar days, and then on Friday night, here is the first of the churches that Dad planted. Next photo. In the next, here are the workers at the end. They laid hands on all of the pastors that were existing. Numbers of those were Foursquare, and then we had a total of 3 that were planted from us. The next conference, here's the next photo. Here's Nigel and Yvonne Davies. Nigel was the best man in my wedding. They were sent to Busselton. And so now the die is set, conferences and planting churches. And so that is the will of God. And so this was something that my father had the ability to impart vision. People wanted, when they heard him preach about vision and what there was something in them, they said, I want to be a part of that. And they saw that Australians could reach Australia, and from that time, church planting began to take off. God was doing a powerful thing, and then we'll come back to Australia later. Final section I want to talk about today, staying the course. This is a profound lesson that we have to learn to this day. As I said, Dad put a man in Prescott because he saw potential in him. He had only planted one church. He had pioneered, did okay, but he was a good preacher, and Dad saw potential. That's my father. He's always looking beyond what you are right now. My father always is looking at what you can be. And so he gave this man the opportunity of a lifetime. This man came and took over the pastorate of the Prescott Church. And of course, because of being the pastor of Prescott, that meant you're going to have influence in our rapidly growing fellowship. By this time, the pattern had been set. It was my father who wrestled through what is God wanting us to do? What should a church be? But by 1981, the pattern was set. We were no longer, we knew. It is to this day, you see what is the motto, the slogan of our church, of our fellowship. It is evangelism, it is discipleship, church planting, and world evangelism. That is what we are. It was set. So this is a Bible pattern. It has to do with that principle of pattern. Hebrews 8, verse 5.
Who served the copy in the shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain.
Okay, pattern, template, blueprint. Moses, I want you to build a tabernacle. What should it be like? I showed you the pattern. All you have to do is follow the pattern. The man took over this church. All he had to do was just keep doing what you saw. Just keep doing what you were taught. Just keep doing what has been proven it works. God is now impacting. The church is flourishing. The fellowship is flourishing. We're reaching the world. Just do that. But he didn't do that. He was smarter than Pastor Mitchell. As many men have felt through the years, from the time that he arrived here in Prescott, he started changing things. He was going to do things better. Immediately, he lessened outreach and started changing some of the outreach focus. He took over the leadership of Prescott. Another man took over at the exact same time, took over the leadership of the conference church in Flagstaff. Both of these men, they became enamored with the church growth movement. And you have to understand how this is dumb as a box of rocks. In those days, you couldn't even watch a video. You couldn't even go to a website and see. They read a book and they saw a couple of articles in a magazine. And so they proposed to change the fellowship from what was proven. Let's follow these guys that I don't even know who they are. And we're now going to do things like they say because I read it in a book. Do you understand how dumb that is? But this is the problem. He began to change. He made some unwise decisions, both in the church and in the fellowship, caused people to lose trust. And so what began to happen, my father began to hear that there were rumblings of trouble in the Prescott church and among pastors in the fellowship, that the end result is ultimately you can have a split or you can lose the work of God in the church or in the fellowship. So my father had to make a very difficult decision. When he went to Australia, he loved it. That is what he wanted to be from the time he was a new convert. He wanted to be a missionary. And now he is starting to plant churches. He's reaching people that have passports to other nations. He saw himself staying there for life. But now he saw, I am going to have to come back to Prescott. I cannot let the work of God be derailed because what I want What I would prefer, that's my dad's feeling, was to stay in Australia, but I can't let the work of God be derailed. So he said, I have to come back. And he took the church back over in Prescott. He had only been there about 18 months, and he made that difficult decision, wound up leaving a man in charge in Perth, and my parents returned to Prescott. They told me that they were going back to America, and by that time I said, no, my future is in Australia. We actually have a picture of the farewell. This is the farewell with me with those big curls. And here is me and my mom saying something witty, no doubt. Lisa's behind me, and that is actually at the farewell. By this time, I had a job in Australia. I was doing an apprenticeship. I was involved in ministry. Lisa and I played in bands. And then Lisa and I were now headed for marriage. Here's a picture, next photo, of a young Greg and Lisa. And here we were headed for marriage. We were I met Lisa in church. I first started talking to her on outreach, in prayer meetings. We are going to do the will of God, and we're going to do it together. So when my parents said, we're going back, it was an easy decision. I knew that my future then was tied to Australia. They left, I stayed in Australia. From that time, the vision that God had given my father, it began to multiply. God's plan in the earth is multiplication. It is not just getting people saved, training them for ministry, or even just planting churches. It is that churches plant churches that plant churches. And now you have a multiplying power. Genesis 9, verse 7.
And as for you, be fruitful and multiply. Bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it.
Okay, this is God speaking to Noah. His plan from the beginning is multiply. If one church is doing right, getting people saved, making disciples, and planting churches, that's not enough. You can't reach the world. But if you plant a church that they're getting people saved, they're making disciples, and they're planting churches, meanwhile, the original church is planting churches, they plant churches, and they're getting people saved, making disciples, and planting churches. Now you have a multiplying power. Now this is exactly what happened is in our fellowship. Now we had multiple churches planting churches, and those churches started planting churches. We have up on the screen. Now we get up to 1983. By 1983, this is only 10 years after we started planting the first church in Wickenburg. By now there were 165 churches planted. And so the work of God is multiplying. And that is the power of, truly the power of our fellowship is every church when we send them out. And you heard me give a charge to Manny in Sunday school, and when we sent them out, Manny, you are there to make disciples and plant churches. Because if we do that, that is the multiplying. Now we have churches all over the world. We're in 135 nations or so. And we have churches planting churches. They get people saved, planting churches. It is the power of multiplication. And that is the strength of our fellowship, is the multiplying power of God. So you see here, we're up to 1983. And now, only 10 years after we started planting churches, from one church, now there are 165. And that was growing rapidly because many of those that had been planted were now planting out, and some of those started planting their own. The multiplying power is the strength of our fellowship. So this is just a few lessons of where we come from. I'm going to talk in later lessons then. Pastor Mitchell returning to Australia and some other dimensions, but this work we got. Pastor Jesse was just in Perth. I was so excited just this past week, he was able to go and preach in pastor seminars in Perth, in the home church. Lisa and I were sent from the church. Now it's in an area called Beachboro, but it's still in Perth. And Jesse was able to see it. He was able to go up to Kings Park and see the place where the photo I have in my office, he's able to see that and able to see for himself the multiplying power of God. We are reaching the world through the power of